Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Siddiqui. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Human Anatomy and Cell Science at the University of Manitoba, and I am also the Director of Outreach for the Manitoba Neuroscience Network. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's Café Scientifique. These cafes are an initiative of the Vice President Research and International at the University of Manitoba, and for the last several years, the Manitoba Neuroscience Network has co-sponsored a cafe during Brain Awareness Week. This is our first event for Brain Awareness Week this year, and I would like to invite you all to join us again on Wednesday at 7 p.m. right here at McNally Robinson. I will be in conversation with Dr. Pierre Marquet, a world-renowned psychiatrist and neuroscientist who has done some groundbreaking research on mental illness. It should be a fascinating discussion, so if you enjoy tonight's event, you'll probably enjoy that one as well, so I hope to see you all then. We have an exciting and very timely topic for tonight's cafe. Autism spectrum disorder, better known as autism, is one of the most common neurological conditions affecting children today. It is something that is both mysterious and misunderstood. Tonight, we really want to dispel misconceptions, and we want to talk about the neuroscience of autism. Our panel of scientists is going to discuss how their research is helping to develop new methods to both diagnose and treat autism. So now I'd like to introduce the moderator for this evening, who will tell you more about the panelists and some of the ground rules that will guide the discussion. Dr. Toby Martin is the director of St. Amant Research Center and a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Manitoba. He completed his graduate studies at the University of Manitoba in psychology, focusing on experimental behavior analysis. Today, his research interests include knowledge translation, computer-aided peer-to-peer learning, and behavior feedback systems. Please welcome Dr. Toby Martin.
Thanks very much, Dr. Hanilla. I didn't see the copy of the bio you were going to read, so I was curious. Pretty accurate. I like this microphone setup because it's pretty tall, but it promotes good posture. So I feel very authoritative. Well, welcome everyone. So, as Dr. Hanilla said, I'll be the moderator for tonight's discussion. And I have a set of ground rules for the event that I'm going to read, and I have some prompts here for myself because it's very important that we get them right. So each of our panelists will introduce their own research for just a couple of minutes or so before we open up the discussion to your questions. And I'll bring the wireless microphone out to you. I get to do the Phil Donahue thing. And so if you raise your hand to ask a question, please just keep it up and I'll make my way over to you quickly. And you should know that this evening's panel discussion is being video recorded for later uploading at the Café Scientifique website. And a link to the video will be posted at umanitoba.ca/Café Scientifique. And I'm sure you can get that URL fairly easily from some of the materials that we have. I'll take the last question at around 8:25, and that'll signal the end of the evening. There are refreshments here on the table, and please feel free to come up and help yourself whenever you need some. You'll notice that there are evaluation forms on the chairs. I guess there were, otherwise you'd be sitting on them. Maybe you are sitting on them. But we ask that you fill those out and leave them for us at the materials table here at the front. It's really helpful in planning and improving these events for you to let us know how you thought it went. And a very important point, this is just a discussion forum, and the speakers here tonight are not in a position to provide any advice on specific problems or treatments. So please keep your questions, of course, specific to the topic, but general in the sense of not being about a particular individual or their needs. Okay, and then I just want to say a few words to introduce the topic on which our speakers will be contributing tonight. So, autism spectrum disorders, and Dr. Henilin introduced this briefly already, really are, as the name, the word spectrum implies, a collection, a set of what we call neurodevelopmental conditions. And by neurodevelopmental, well, that's actually going to come out in tonight's discussion as well. We don't know exactly how many people have an ASD, but you commonly hear reports that among children, the number is something like between 1 in 100, maybe even up to 1 in 50. Now, there are clinical diagnostic criteria for an ASD. And you've probably heard something like this before. There are two key ones. One is that the individual has persistent difficulty with, let's say, social communication. And so this can include things like normal turn-taking in conversation. It could include things like a difficulty with nonverbal communication, like eye contact and facial expressions. And there are some other examples as well, but this has to be a persistent difficulty for the individual that starts when they're very young. Now, the other diagnostic category you've probably also heard of in connection with autism, which is it's called restricted or repetitive behaviors or interests. And so this can be, in terms of behaviors, this could be something that the person does or says in a very specific way over and over again. It can also be, I'm just going to actually make a little prompt to interrupt myself here. If you have a cell phone with you now, if you could turn off the ringer, just take a second, that'd be appreciated by, I don't mind, but this, we have our speakers contributing their time and I want to be respectful to them. So in addition to repetitive movements, it might be a very restricted interest in a particular topic or a particular sensory stimulation. And it might actually also involve kind of an unusual response to some sensory stimulation. And there are some other features that go along with these diagnostic criteria. But one important thing to note is that an ASD, an autism spectrum disorder, is not the same as an intellectual disability. But it may go along with an intellectual disability. It's also important to note that there's a wide range of the severity in terms of those diagnostic criteria that I described. And the greater the severity, the greater the impact on both the individual and, of course, on their family. But also please note that those criteria that I described are entirely behavioral. There is no brain scan. There is no genetic test that will tell you if a person has autism. Although, of course, imaging, brain imaging, and genetic tests are an important part of autism research. And yet, so how do we get to neuroscience? Well, we know, of course, how important the brain is to the typical development of behavior. And that's how we arrive at the topic for this evening's Café. So I'll introduce our speakers one at a time, starting with Dr. Tabrez Siddiqui on our left. His research focuses on learning how nerve cell connections that we call synapses form and function in the developing and adult brain. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Physiology and Pathophysiology in the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences at the U of M, and the principal investigator of neuroscience research at the Kleysen Institute for Advanced Medicine at Health Sciences Center. So please help me welcome Dr. Siddiqui. And I think it makes more sense for each speaker to introduce their own research, and then I'll introduce the next speaker and so on. So Dr. Siddiqui, would you like to talk about your research for a moment?
Okay, so thank you for the introduction that you gave about the phenotypic features of autism. I'd like to start by saying that what are considered disorders of cognition and behavior, such as autism spectrum disorders, are really part of the continuum of normal human variation. that is present throughout the human population. And so the autism spectrum disorder is just part of that continuum. And so there are these variations in brain structure and functions which produce these developmental delays. And these are under direct genetic influence. So among all the neurodevelopmental and psychiatric disorders that have been studied, the autism spectrum disorders have perhaps the highest genetic component, estimates from 70 to 90% of genetic component. And these can be both heritable as well as de novo mutations. And so heritable is understandable, passes down from a parent to a child. But de novo mutations are those that arise in the germline, in the egg or the sperm, and account for about 20 to 25% of autistic individuals. Now, a regular conception of a child will pass on about 10,000, approximately 10,000 de novo mutations in the genome. And then life goes on as normal because they do not severely impact function. But if one of these mutations happens to fall in one of these genes that are associated with autism, then that will lead to the development of autism spectrum disorders. So to an extent, it is a game of chance. And the common variations that are present among the human population and in the autistic individual is in fact hypothesized to be the part of the contributions to variations that are required for human evolution. So many of the neurodevelopmental or psychiatric disorders such as autism, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder, not only are they highly heritable, they are quite common in the population, and they have a great deal of correlation in their underlying genetic causes. So as a neuroscientist, one of the challenges we face is how do we understand these disorders to be distinct, and how do we understand what are the overlapping features. And my own research studies these aspects from a molecular and cellular perspective. So the first question is obviously which parts of the brain are more affected in autism. And prominent among these are those brain regions that are required for higher order cognitive functioning, such as those that are required for multimodal network, those that are connecting different parts of the hemisphere, upper layers of the cortex, the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, and even going back to the motor and sensory cortices. These are among a few of the brain regions that are affected. And my research really goes right from the genetic level up to the animal behavior level. And when I invoke genetics, it is less of a deterministic feature, but more to serve as a framework for understanding the risk for developing the autism spectrum disorder. And it is eventually the interaction of the environment and the genome that underlies the etiologies of autism spectrum disorders. So far about 200 to 400 genes in many genetic association studies, about 200 to 400 genes have been found to be associated with autism. And not a single gene is associated with more than 1% of autistic cases. So now we have a very complex disorder with a complex genetic underlying causes. And that partially explains the heterogeneity among autistic individuals. So where do we begin to study autism? And there must be a method to this madness. So one of the ways to start making sense of this genetic data is to pool them together and see if they fall into modes, into some, whether they're all part of some signaling mechanism in the brain, that they may be connected to each other. And indeed, when you put them together, you realize that about 3/4 of those genes are either directly or indirectly connected with the development or plasticity of brain connections known as synapses. So what are synapses? A synapse is a junction between two neurons and is a highly specialized functional unit and is the fundamental unit for computation in the brain. It is the structure at which information is passed from one neuron to another, and that information can modify the properties of the synapse to make synapses respond differently to new signals. And the human brain is incredibly complex, with about 86 billion neurons, each forming thousands to 10,000 neurons synapses onto other neurons. So forming a really complex network. And it is an axiom of neurobiology that circuit function derives from these distinct synaptic information channels that coalesce into higher order network function. And that is required for cognition, emotion, sensation, and all other higher brain functions. Our hope is that even by studying a small number of these synaptic genes, we can understand signaling networks comprised of several dozen genes that are affected in neural circuits of autistic individuals. So my research is focused on a set of autism-associated synaptic genes that are critically important for the development of synapses in the developing brain, their maintenance in the adult brain, and for mediating experience-dependent changes, or a phenomenon known as plasticity, in synapses throughout life. My group studies these processes at multiple levels, from molecular to behavioral, to understand their synaptic and circuit level mechanisms and the consequences on learning, memory, anxiety, motor function, emotion, and sociability. We are able to go into the brains of mice, modify the genetic component of specific cell types in defined neural circuits, and study their impact on cognition and behavior. We can model autism-associated genetic mutations in cultured nerve cells and in mice, and study their impact on function. And using nanoscopes, we are developing our ability to delve deep into brain tissue of live behaving animals and record the activity of thousands of neurons while the animal is engaged in a behavioral task. We are identifying potential targets for therapeutic intervention and are interested in going to the next steps in developing small molecules and peptides that can enhance or attenuate activity of specific synaptic connections in defined brain regions, with a net beneficial outcome on cognition, behavior, and mental flexibility. And I will end by saying, on a more philosophical level, that the human condition is really a combination of strengths and weaknesses, but strengths can come with weaknesses that we have chosen to call disability. And aspects of psychiatric disorders are probably collateral damage in the process of selection of positive traits in the continuous advancement of human evolution. And now, while in these discussions we refer to these variations as disorders, are they indeed disorders? And for example, the determination of intellectual quotient, or IQ, is highly subjective and does not take into consideration one's spatial navigation abilities or intricacies of depth of knowledge of a specific thing, artistic or musical abilities, or indeed the ability to obsess about an object for inordinate amounts of time. In a different universe, had human capital been derived from, say, our focus on lining up objects in a certain pattern, or being obsessed about a certain object, such as an elevator, the bulk of the human race, which obsesses over social interaction, would have been deemed autistic. So disability is not uniform and confined to those of us on the spectrum. Each one of us in this audience may be good at some things or highly impaired at other things. But the variation is what it is and presents us with an opportunity to understand fundamental organization of the brain, its structure, its function. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Siddiqui. We're talking about depth of knowledge. I don't mean to already be sort of geeking out as a fanboy on this event, but it's a marvel to me that, and a pleasant one, that I've been involved in research related to autism for, I don't know, something like 16 or 17 years. And Boy, I know very little about what Dr. Siddiqui was just talking about, and I think that's wonderful. There's so much to know and so much to learn. Okay, moving on. So sitting beside Dr. Siddiqui is Dr. Cheryl Glazebrook, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management at U of M. She studies how the nervous system integrates information from different senses to perform precise movements, and seeks to understand perceptual motor performance in individuals with developmental disorders as well as neurological disorders and injuries. Please help me welcome Dr. Cheryl Glazebrook.
Thank you. It's nice to see so many friendly faces out in the audience. I'm actually going to start slightly off topic, but I promise we will quickly return to autism and neuroscience, and that is with the term muscle memory. How many people have heard that term before? Yeah. I found myself using it this weekend. I was working on some dances, and I really got that one in muscle memory. But in fact, our muscles have no memory. And our memories for how we move are actually distributed throughout our nervous system, throughout our brain, as well as our spinal cord is capable of elements of learning as well. And important for us today is that moving, and when we learn a new skill, for example, when we learn to brush our teeth or we learn how to make breakfast, we actually need to engage a lot of our brain and many networks. And that's why learning something new is so difficult, because we're engaging so many different parts of our brain. And as it gets easier, so as we get, motor skill becomes easier, we actually start to consolidate those different pathways, and those pathways are formed by those synapses that Dr. Siddiqui nicely described for us. And as we become more skilled and those pathways become more refined, we don't have to think as hard about what we're doing. But it also represents that adaptive plasticity within our brain that allows us to move and do other things as well. And a really important part of what we're learning when we learn a new motor skill is how to pick up and interpret the sensory information in our environment. And it's not just sensing that it's there, so being able to sense that you saw something or heard something, but it's also being able to perceive and make sense of it. And the really hard thing about motor skills is to do it well, we need to do it non-consciously. So I can't ask you about it, because as soon as I ask you about it, now you're using different pathways. And so this is one of the things that in part makes it really interesting, but makes it more difficult to study. Now, related to autism, we know that many people with autism experience sensory information differently. So in some cases it can be a heightened experience, so the sense of close can be very distracting or uncomfortable. It can also be sound, and that sound can be distracting, but it also can be an enhanced ability. So the ability for perfect pitch, which is probably the opposite of what I have, because I faked every ear test and every piano exam I ever did, is the ability to be able to reproduce a pitch off the top of your head, essentially. And I will not even, Janine joked about singing, we won't even go there. But that difference in how we use sensory information gives us those different abilities and can make us better at certain things and can make certain tasks harder. And relevant to motor skills, the two really important pieces of sensory input are visual input, so the information we're picking up around us, but also our body awareness. And our body awareness involves our sense of touch. It involves, if we close our eyes, we know that our arm is in front of us. I'll try not to hit anybody while I do that. And we can know where our body is in space. And normally on a day-to-day basis, our brain, thankfully, takes care of paying attention to what we hear, paying attention to where our body is in space, and helps us be able to sit in our chairs or to stand, to walk around. It helps us be able to reach for an object and not have to think about every little step along the way. And what's really wonderful is that our brain is very flexible. And so, for example, in the dark, we're able to then switch our balance control to use other senses other than vision in order to accommodate for that. Now, when we're looking across the literature for autism, what we notice is that there's some differences in particular with this visual interpretation of information as well as body awareness. And from the visual perspective, we see that if I ask you to reach out and touch an object or reach up and pick a cup, or in some cases, other researchers use robots and have people play video games with these robots and move cursors on the screen, what we see is that people with autism often find that more difficult and prefer to rely on a sense of where their body is in space, or that body awareness. And from a neuroscience perspective, this makes a lot of sense because our primary motor cortex and our primary somatosensory cortex, which is the part that takes care of a lot of this body awareness, are right beside each other. And so it's easier, in one sense, you can think, to make those connections between those two areas of the brain. On the other hand, our visual information, now that's at the back of our head. And so that takes longer connections in order to connect those two areas. And so using that proprioceptive information becomes more preferred and easier than using that visual information. And so one example from our lab that we recently finished is we had people reach out and touch a target using what we call a natural reaching movement. And then we also had people slide along the table. And one of the differences between sliding my finger and picking up and reaching is that when I'm sliding my finger, I get some extra tactile input about where my finger is in space. When I lift my finger, now visual information becomes the more practical one to use, in conjunction with body awareness, because certainly we can point at something without seeing our limb. And what was interesting is we saw no differences for adults if they're what we call typically developing or didn't have autism. If they slid their fingers, people with autism were just as good as people who didn't have autism. But when we asked people to pick up and point, then we started to see that those movements, if you had autism, it took you longer to complete those movements. It's not that you don't do it, but it just takes longer in order to do that. Other researchers have looked at this from a motor learning perspective. So at Johns Hopkins, they've done a series of studies using a robot arm. And what they found is that if you learn this new, what they call visual motor adaptation, which really just means you're moving this robot arm and a cursor moves on the screen, but it doesn't move, if you move straight, the cursor moves curved. So you have to learn how to move your limb in space, like we need to do for many everyday tasks. And what happens is they do a number of different, what we call transfer conditions, to see how you can adapt to new situations. What they found were that the children without autism, they were better able to adapt and use the visual information, suggesting that they were really using the visual pathways to learn the task. Whereas people with autism were better able to convert it to the proprioceptive, or in other words, that body awareness. And so when we think about this, this really changes how people are moving and interacting in their environment. And from a developmental perspective, that initial visual input is really important for learning about the world around us. So if I point over there, maybe I've caught a few people, we have a tendency to look and see what we're pointing at. And you have to use that visual information, and that's known as a form of joint attention. And as newborns too, some of the most important information they're picking up is learning about the visual input and identifying the faces in their environment and learning how to respond. On the other hand, the proprioceptive information is what we're starting to integrate as we get a little bit older. And so that visual information, if it's taking you longer to use that visual information and make a motor response, and be able to react to that input in your environment, it means you might be missing out on some of those reciprocal interactions. So that by the time you're ready to respond, our sort of standardized social cues say it took too long. And so people have moved on. And so you miss out on that reward of receiving a response for your interaction or your motor response in what you're doing. And so this sets up a difference in how we're interacting and learning in our environment. And this idea of taking longer to respond, we've seen in studies that I've done in my lab, as well as there's some researchers in Australia that have done quite a bit of motor work, as well as the group at Johns Hopkins. This taking longer to react to a response is something that's quite consistent. And we have to really think about that when we're engaging and working with people, is helping people just understand to slow down that pace of that visual information. And it also comes into this idea of observational learning. As I was saying, children and infants, a lot of the way they learn about their world is by observing. And we use this throughout the school system as well. We've all had our science teachers show us how to perform the experiment. Our gym teacher will demonstrate for us how to perform that skill. And so we're relying on being able to rapidly pick up that visual information, remember, and then use it. And this is a difficult task. And it may explain why many kids with autism actually prefer to come and move your hand to show you something. What they're actually telling us might be that I like to be taught by you moving me and showing me how to move. I actually find that visual information quite difficult to use. And so when we think about teaching motor skills or the kind of instructional environment, we have to think about what our goals are. So if the goal is something like learning handwriting or teaching a cooking skill, we may want to take away the challenge of using that visual input and make use of that preference for proprioceptive feedback. So for example, in my previous life in Ontario, I spent a number of years working at a cooking class for people with autism. And one of the instructional modes that we used quite frequently was hand-over-hand guidance. And we found that this was a really helpful way to teach something like whisking or stirring or chopping, how much force we need to apply. So we typically would teach that by showing, this is how you do it, this is how you stir, this is how you whisk, this is how you cut. But what we found is that for many people, using that hand over hand, it's a more direct route, it's a preferred way of receiving that information. So if the goal is learning this more complicated or new motor skill, we want to really make use of the preferred sensory information for people. On the other hand, it's not that we want to ignore and have practice using the visual information, because the ability to pick up visual information and use it and respond is integral to any social interaction. And we can think about this kind of communication as one of the most complex situations that we had to pick up multiple sources of sensory information, because now not only do we have to know our own body awareness, where am I in space, I have to be able to observe other people's reactions, observe what they're doing. I also have to be able to integrate now that auditory information into what I'm doing. And so this is a very complex situation. And then speaking is infinitely more complex than a simple reach to point. And so it's a much more complex task. And so one of our goals right now is still understanding, we're at a stage of understanding what are the differences in these different control situations, but we're, I would say, just about there to start looking at what does that mean for how we teach motor skills, and can we create situations that help people learn to use that visual information. So we, just to finish off, know that as things become more complex, if we add a reach and a grasp as opposed to a simple point, if we add auditory information into the task, every time we make something more complicated, we start to see more differences. And these differences, of course, can vary from individual to individual, but it's a beginning to start understanding how it is we're interacting, because for many of us, we don't think about what we're doing, and so we need to practice to be able to do that, so that you don't have to think about the sensory information you need to interpret or perceive and the motor responses that you need to make.
Again, I thought that was excellent. I didn't come here tonight to find more work to do, but there's about 6 project ideas I'd like to talk to you about, to collaborate with.
Awesome.
Okay, and next to Dr. Glazebrook is Dr. Janine Montgomery. Janine is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology. She directs research in the Social Cognition Lab related to social emotional thinking, learning, and behavior, and outcomes related to well-being, examining typical and atypical social emotional development. Please help me welcome Dr. Janine Montgomery.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Toby. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. It's wonderful to see so many people interested in autism and supporting people with autism, so thank you all for coming out. So as Toby told you, much of my research revolves understanding social emotional connections, and particularly how social interactions relate to emotional competencies. So that is my main area of research, although my autism research also looks at other areas, including things like assessment and diagnosis. We're also looking at girls on the autism spectrum, which is an overlooked population, girls and women on the autism spectrum. And we're also doing some work in adult interventions, and interventions from the age of 7 all the way up to 21 as well. So of course, that reflects a large range of individuals. So another thing I should mention before I start explaining my research is that my research lab primarily looks at higher functioning, I'm going to say that with air quotes, individuals with autism. We use that term for lack of a better word. Unfortunately, it's not great and can sometimes be misconstrued. But what we mean by this is individuals who don't also have an intellectual delay or an intellectual disability. And so the individuals we look at tend to be children and youth and adults, often who aren't diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder until they're about 7 years old, or even later, particularly if you're a female, and then right into the adult lifespan. And so our work involves not only understanding the characteristics related to the concepts that Toby spoke about, but also understanding interventions in those different areas and age groups. So what can you do that can help support people to have better lives and have better social and emotional outcomes that hopefully relate to their well-being. So that's kind of the premise of what we do. What we know about autism, as Toby so nicely summarized at the beginning of this session, is that one of the hallmark features is difficulties in social interactions. And while we often talk about social interactions, sometimes we forget that social interactions are emotional interactions. So our research lab has really been looking at the emotional component in addition to some other neuropsychological elements, like executive functions that occur in the prefrontal cortex, and some of the other aspects that might reflect things like the limbic system and other areas of the brain. And so what we've been doing, primarily one of the areas our lab looks into that many other labs don't, and in fact I think we were one of the first labs to do this in autism spectrum disorder, is a concept called emotional intelligence. Now when I say emotional intelligence, I'm not talking about Dr. Daniel Goleman's book. While that is a popularized version, it is a watered down and not very scientific version of what emotional intelligence really is. But the good news is, researchers, primarily from Yale and Harvard in the United States, have developed 2 other models of emotional intelligence, and there are a few others beside those, but 2 really well-researched, well-validated models of emotional intelligence that predict important things in life, like whether you can reason with information that is social and emotional, or whether you can manage your own emotions in a social situation, whether it be positive or negative social information. And I put those air quotes in again because to me, all emotions just are. Humans tend to put a valence on that, a meaning that, you know, sad is bad and happy is good. However, the range of emotions that humans experience have a lot of functional adaptations. So for example, if someone's sad, we comfort them. If you're angry, you might become an advocate. You may even change the world. So I have a little bit of an issue when we talk about positive versus negative emotions. A little bit of a sideline there. So what we've been doing then is looking at 2 particular models. One is called the ability model of emotional intelligence. And really what that is how do you use your intellectual skills to reason about information that is primarily social and emotional. And so that involves whether you understand what facial expressions mean, whether you can interpret changing facial expressions as they change in a millisecond and keep up with that in a social interaction, whether you can take in information like what Dr. Glazebrook does. So looking at the motor aspects, looking at movements going on around you and what that might tell you about a social situation, listening to the tone of voice, understanding what gestures mean, all sorts of different social information that we have to understand and make sense of to have a good social interaction. So that's a component of what emotional intelligence reflects. Another component is whether you can manage your stress in different sorts of situations and whether you're able to adapt to new situations. So those elements are largely captured by something called the trait model of emotional intelligence. And I like to see the difference between the 2 models as what do you know about emotions and social situations versus how do you apply what you know. And that's the trait model. So we have the ability, it's your thinking and reasoning, and the trait is more about what characteristics do you have that help you cope with social emotional information. So our current work in our lab actually emerged from some of my doctoral work. I had worked with an academic who was very well known in emotional intelligence, and he said to me one day, "Janine, what do you think about this?" And my initial reaction was I had read Daniel Goleman's work and said, this is pseudopsychology, this is pop psychology, this isn't science. So although he's a great place to start, he really leads some people down the wrong pathways. Then I started reading the research and I said, oh, wait a minute, there's something here, and there's two different types. Now, knowing that people with autism spectrum disorder struggle in social situations and often have unusual emotional reactions in different situations, my hypothesis was both areas would be problematic. And actually that's not what we found. So my initial doctoral research was in adults, young adults from 16 to 21. And we were looking at their emotional intelligence and trait and ability form, as well as did that actually matter in terms of predicting how good they were in social situations. So what we found was, overall, their ability to reason with social information, solve problems with social information, reflect on what had happened in their day, and make logical decisions and evaluations of those things was actually as good as kids without, or as young people without autism. And in fact, they exceeded our typical populations in one area, which was, surprisingly, understanding emotions. And so we looked at that data a little bit more, and what we saw, like Dr. Glazebrook's work, is that our people with autism actually outperformed people without autism, but they took twice as long to do the tasks required for them to get to the adaptive social answer to those questions. So again, that reflects this idea that sometimes we need to give a little more time and teach some patience skills, and people who are working with people with autism give people time to process information. So that's one of the implications from that particular area. In contrast, in the area in terms of skills and characteristics and personality traits even that make you better in social emotional situations, we found that our people with autism reported that they were 1 standard deviation, so that is significantly below the typical individuals. We also found that their parents reported that they were 2 standard deviations below, and we found that people with autism actually endorsed items in a more positive way than probably was really what they were experiencing. So the take-home message from that is they already had skills that were deemed significantly lower than typically developing individuals of the same age and relatively similar IQ, and yet they were probably underreporting the extent of their difficulties, which is not really that surprising. People don't like to point those things out, that I had deficits in those areas. But they were telling us the truth. They just didn't tell us how severe those issues were for them. So given all of that information, that kind of started some other research in our lab where we've looked at younger individuals. So we looked at 12 to 16-year-olds and their development of both forms of emotional intelligence. And what we found in those studies was that kids at that age actually were having difficulties in both areas. So it appears there might be some catch-up that goes on as people age and as their prefrontal cortex becomes more sophisticated but isn't completely developed yet. We're still examining that, and future research in our lab is looking across the age band, starting from 7-year-olds all the way up to adults, to examine that trajectory. What does this look like for people with and without autism? So we're always looking for people with autism and people without autism to participate in our study. So I'm going to take a quick moment to mention that both Cheryl and I have some recruiting information for some ongoing studies. So should you have a moment and you are able to pass it out to someone you know or take it for yourself, we'd really, really greatly appreciate that. Research doesn't happen without participants. So in terms of that, so we are still doing a lot of work on emotional characteristics, on social outcomes. One of the things we did find is that our low trait emotional intelligence predicted poor social skills, it also predicted a high level of social stress, so that individuals with autism in social situations who had underdeveloped trait EI also reported those social situations were really hard for them. So what that also probably tells you is they're going to avoid them if they're very hard for them, and they will not have that opportunity to take advantage of the brain's amazing plasticity and benefit from repeated practice in those situations. So after we've looked at the characteristics, and we've had a number of other studies as well, but we've actually moved into intervention programming now. So that is largely because I have amazing students who come and knock on my door and say, I really want to learn more about this, and I'd like to go with them. So as a result, we have done social skills interventions programs. We have done executive function training components, so helping kids to coaching kids to develop those skills in the prefrontal cortex. And we've also recently been doing interventions aimed at emotional intelligence and something called mindfulness. Anybody in the audience familiar with mindfulness? So there's a lot of different definitions of mindfulness, but we're using the very secular, non-religious form of mindfulness. And basically it is being aware of, in the moment, of what's happening around you in an attentive way, and being also able to bring in some skills that are taught in mindful programs into those everyday interactions. So that's what we've been doing. We've been running some groups with young kids, where we're teaching them a mindfulness program out of the UK. Our results in those programs, both from parent perspectives and from teacher perspectives and from child perspectives, are that there are a number of areas improving. For example, anxiety is decreasing in these individuals as they're learning new coping skills. Parents are reporting fewer problem behaviors, and teachers, while we don't have as many reporting back to us, are echoing that same pattern, that they're seeing fewer outbursts or fewer behavioral challenges in the classroom at school. And kids themselves are telling us they're feeling better about themselves and that they're using and that they have favorite coping strategies. So my heart is kind of there right now when kids are telling me something makes them feel like a better person and feel better about themselves as a person. And when they walk away saying they're gaining some skills, I see that as really promising for the future. That said, mindfulness intervention programs are still widely preliminary in the research, although they are gaining a lot of support from different areas of research, including for different populations, like for people with depression, for people with attention deficit, and all those sorts of things. What mindfulness teaches you, in my mind, is self-regulation. And in the olden days, there used to be this cry that social skills programs don't work. The research shows they don't work. I would actually argue that if you look carefully at the research that looks across different programming, there are some programs that seem to work quite well, but the ones that work the best provide lots of opportunities for students to practice the skills over and over and over, not in just one setting. They also teach the skills to the parents and the other people working, whether they be teachers or care workers or support workers that work with those individuals, so that there is some consistency across environments. And yeah, they also monitor kids, right? So we don't just go in and teach social skills and say, okay, this is a face, this is a happy face. First of all, we check if we know those, if the students know those things, and we start where their needs are. So we do a lot of assessment informing those interventions. So I think that's about all I have to say. I always write notes and then don't say everything, but I'm sure some of these things will come in questions afterwards. But ultimately, where my research is going right now that we've started to do some preliminary understanding of characteristics reflecting that neuropsychological basis of difficulties in autism spectrum, and we've started to do some interventions that are showing us behavioral attributes reflecting change in some of those processes and improvements in those processes. My dream is to get this into schools. So rather than just worry about doing this just for people with autism, I'm starting to step back a little bit now, and as Toby mentioned, my work is around social and emotional learning. That is the target for autism spectrum disorders. It's also the target for depression, for anxiety, to a smaller extent, ADHD, and it's a target in a situation where we have an increasing challenge with mental health issues in the schools. And so ultimately that's where I'd like to see my research going, and then we're starting to build grants with that, with the aim of not only helping people with autism, but also helping all children and youth to develop better mental health and to develop skills that will get them there and help them to deal with a variety of situations. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. I've known Janine for a long time, and there is absolutely no doubting her passion for these topics, because every time I talk to her, I hear the passion that you just heard. And what a well-chosen panel. I think that what each of the panelists have said shows how many facets there are to this topic of the neuroscience of autism. And so let's learn a little bit more with some questions. I'm going to now open up the floor and a few preliminary, before your hands go up, a few preliminary notes. If you think that your question is best directed to a specific panelist, by all means, say so, if you'd like to hear from somebody on a particular topic. Otherwise, I'll kind of open it up to the panel, and we'll decide amongst ourselves who would like to sort of speak towards it. And also, very, very important, don't forget about the refreshments. Okay, yes, I'm going to bring the microphone to you in the back, which I thought I just turned off, but I did not. I'm coming back there.
This is my question for the lady who talked the last there. We arrived a little bit late, but I just wanted to ask if the techniques that you have developed working with children and young adults and so on, can any of those be used for the midlife crisis people out there who are coming across this thing that all of a sudden they're losing it and they're wondering why?
That's a really good question. I think social and emotional skills are certainly a concern throughout the lifespan for many of us, and many of us didn't actually learn or had those skills modeled around us as we were growing up. So I think there's certainly some place for that. That said, my intervention programs I work with, most of them I don't design myself, although there are some we have, are primarily targeted towards the needs of people with autism spectrum. So those particular programs might not be great, but certainly social emotional interventions for people coping with stress and change are well supported by research, and like, for example, the mindfulness literature is one of those things that many people who are experiencing crisis and change and those sorts of things might find beneficial. Help?
My question actually is not just for one of the panel, but for absolutely everybody. And I don't know if I have a question or a challenge, because I'm actually on the spectrum myself. I have Asperger's syndrome, and I'm not afraid to say that either. But my question is around the term autism spectrum disorder, which I know it was, I forget when I think it was the American Psychological Association lumped that whole thing together. But as someone who's on several like support groups, what I found is a lot of people dislike that, and it's literally like wiped our identity. It's wiped who we are right off the map. My question for the three of you is, how do the three of you feel using the term autism spectrum disorder? Because when you really look, there are definitive differences between autism and Asperger's, and I wonder how the three of you feel using that term as opposed to using specific terms.
That's great, thank you.
I can go. I can. Well, I mean, this was changed in 2013, where DSM5 Criteria was launched, and all of these various disorders were all, or you could call them conditions, were lumped together within the autism spectrum disorders. And one of the reasons why they did that was the underlying neurobiological basis was not entirely distinct. Although the manifestations may be variable, at the circuit level and the molecular level, they're not very different. And that is why it was believed that if there are going to be interventions in one form of the spectrum, those interventions may be beneficial to people on the other part of the spectrum. And that's why they generated that notion. Does that help? But having said that, like we talked about higher functioning and autism, and within the autism spectrum, you have people with all sorts of functioning levels, right? And many of the people in the Asperger's are higher functioning, which is great. But I mean, many of the core deficits are common across the spectrum.
Drs. Glazebrook or Montgomery, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I'll comment from two different perspectives. One is this idea of identity. I know a number of the adults I know don't like the term disorder, and I would agree, and many of them prefer, we're always taught in school right now in university to use person-first terminology, somebody with autism. And I can remember a number of the adults I know from Southern Ontario, and he would stand up and say, I don't have anything, I'm autistic, and I love it, and that's who I am. And so don't give me anything, I am autistic. And I think we need to remember that, and we need to listen to people about how, and not just assume that, well, we decided person-first terminology is the way to go, and not listen to how people want to be referred to. I think that's really important. We always ask somebody, how do you pronounce your name? It seems appropriate to ask. But I think also I think about it more these days in terms of autisms. And because, for example, in a lot of my work we see such differences in sensory information and sensory processing. And while we have sort of generalities that we can say, everybody is unique, and the way that those connections are formed are unique. And one study we had done, we looked at how people pass a tool to one another. And if I tell you that that person's going to use the pen or not, whether or not you turn it around to help them. And what was really interesting, and we had reviewers that kept saying, you have to run stats on this, and we kept saying, no, it's not an honest description of the data. And what it was that we had 4 distinct groups of participants. One group performed just like the typical population, in that they turned the tool around. Another group never turned the tool around, didn't change their behavior, always passed the tool in the same way. Another group did sort of a random, sometimes they turned it around, sometimes they didn't. But importantly, one group figured it out. They did the first 2 trials not turning the tool around, and then they figured it out with no prompts whatsoever. And so that, to me, that reminds us that even when we're seeing, if you lumped all the data together, you got one picture, but when you pulled it apart, these were very unique people and situations. And I think an important part, from the genetics all the way up to the social emotional intelligence and the sensory processing, is for us to try to understand what are potentially the different subgroupings, or what are the different characteristics that we need to understand, and so that it's never going to be a cookie-cutter approach for every autistic person. That, as Janine said, we need to do lots of assessment. We need to assess who this person is and what their goals are as well, right? Because not everybody. I have a family member who, they're like, well, he just doesn't like to go out. He always wants to work. He works 7 days a week. But he was a nuclear physicist, and he liked to work 7 days a week, and he worked 70 hours a week his entire life. And many people would say, oh, he's a workaholic, but he was happy. And that was what he wanted to do. And so maybe we need to not be so worried about that, and go with people's strengths from that standpoint.
Well, I think I would echo a lot of these perspectives, but I do have to say I was one of the sticklers when they changed the DSM that was not very happy with the change. And primarily that comes from the fact that I've worked with a lot of adults with Asperger's syndrome in particular, who feel that they have a community and an identity around that, and changing it without their consultation, I think, was really, really problematic, and maybe not respecting the dignity of who those individuals are. In addition, from an intervention perspective, one of the purposes of the DSM, which is the guidebook that tells us what these categories are and occasionally changes their names, and then we have to learn it all over again. From the perspective of the DSM, a diagnostic category should lead you to how you treat that individual, and that is still my concern with the current category, although they have brought in some specifiers to help you decide whether someone's needs are mild or moderate or severe. For example, if you have a child without any words, who is completely nonverbal and communicates by pointing and yelling or by behaviors, versus a child who is reading Shakespeare by the time they're 5, your intervention programs are going to look very, very different. And the other thing I want to mention, and that I totally agree with you on, is this idea that even if we start to have subgroups like Asperger's, when we look at people with Asperger's, we see so much diversity within that group too. So I think we have to be very careful with the labels and names. However, if people feel they help them, then we need to respect that. And so I think that's one of the underwriting things, is let's ask the community. And again, like Cheryl said, let's ask people. what's your preferred terminology, and go with that and respect their right.
Great responses. Thank you. Yes, I'll come back to you.
I can talk loud, I think.
I think they want
Toby, they want it on the mic.
Yeah, it's for the recording.
My son is diagnosed with autism, and he's 5, and he's receiving ABH services from St. Amant 33 hours, I think, 32 to 33 hours a week, something like that. And he's changed dramatically. I would say behavioral modification is amazing. I was doing a lot of research and reading and really concerned, and it's hard to watch like him learn everything, but almost everything is hand over hand, and everything is a full prompt until he independently learns it, and it's amazing. I mean, it's a miracle, like from when he began in September to today. He can actually do so much more. It's amazing. It's just a behavioral, thing. So I was just wondering what part of your research also touches on ABA, and can these kids grow on the spectrum? Can they? Because I've seen him evolve in a humongous way, just with the tutoring. So I mean, I don't know. Can you change from like being lower on the spectrum to getting higher? Were you always higher? Was it just that people just didn't understand? Like, I'm confused. Like, was he always?
There is some research that shows with the appropriate early interventions, one can change trajectories. So, oh gosh, give me the name, Cheryl Satsmari and friends out of Ontario. Satsmari. They actually looked at individuals who early on got early language intervention and early ABA, and then tracked them. And what they found is over time these kids did not look like so-called low functioning, that they looked more like a high functioning form of autism. So absolutely, there's always potential for those sorts of things. In terms of my interventions, they are not ABA interventions for a couple of reasons. We're generally dealing with higher functioning kids. It's not my expertise, but we bring behavioral elements into it. There's always behavioral elements with everything we do. So we do a lot of rewarding for on-task sorts of things. If consequences are required, those are put up front, and tons of modeling as well. So while we are not pure ABA, we certainly draw on those behavioral techniques, and good intervention does.
I'll just take from there. I mean, there are many different types of behavioral interventions. There are RDI and DIR, flow time, and others, and I think different forms will affect different individuals differently. And it's great that your child is improving with that therapy. I just wanted to talk to you about this concept of plasticity in the brain, which is the primary focus of my research. So recently, one of my students was trying to delete a specific gene from the dorsal part of the hippocampus, which is required for learning and memory. And what happened after we completed those experiments was that we found that inadvertently the region of the hippocampus that we were trying to delete the gene in was entirely removed. And before we realized that, we had done behavioral tests on those animals. Okay, so spatial navigation tests. And these mice which had deleted the way in which we had removed the hippocampus, they performed poorly. But the test lasted for about 15 days. And at the end of 15 days, the mice which had lost the part of the hippocampus were performing just as well as the mice that did not. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that and also, like, if you take examples of stroke, if you have a stroke in the motor area of the brain, and with adequate interventions, you will have remapping of connections in the premotor area. The other parts of the brain will start taking over. So the plasticity is there, and in the early childhood, that is it's easier to intervene because the brain is more plastic. But what we are also finding is that brain plasticity is also present at later stages. So if a child is diagnosed in the teenagers, all is not lost. So in our research, what we're trying to do is create microenvironments in the brain that would generate plasticity, or create an environment by which then you can go and do those interventions and improve behavioral function. And so part of that is like trying to develop small molecules. And one of the things that does not need pharmacological intervention and has been shown in research to increase plasticity that will improve function, even in older children, is an enriched environment. An enriched environment with intense play and fun, and a stress-free environment will improve function.
Yeah, I'll just add one little note to that is in the more general motor learning literature, so how we learn movements, is there's a lot of recent interest and acknowledgement in the idea that when people are motivated or interested in learning, it actually sets the brain chemistry in a way that it's basically, you can think about it being primed or warmed up or prepared to learn. So anything we can do to help with that motivation, and that motivation, of course, is going to change from person to person, that can really set the stage in order to be able to take sort of maximum advantage of whatever the task or the activity is.
I just want to know what ABA is, please. And going forward, can we just make sure that we speak to the acronyms first? Thanks.
Sure, I can just quickly comment. So that's applied behavior analysis. There is a well-known intervention for children with autism that you may also hear called early intensive behavioral intervention. And ABA actually, although many of us in the field will use the term ABA to refer to this early intensive behavioral intervention, for which, by the way, of course, we have another acronym, the IBI. Nothing goes unacronymed in science. But ABA is it's a broader approach to psychology from which EIBI grew. It just so happens in the history of the development and dissemination of that intervention, people started using the term ABA to refer to the therapy as well. But yes, more briefly, yes, it's applied behavior analysis. Well, thanks very much for those responses. And
I actually had a question for Dr. Glazebrook, right? Yeah. Based on what you were saying, are you familiar at all with the PROMPT program?
A little bit, not in detail.
So, I mean, based on what you were saying, would you find that likely to be an effective way to teach autistic kids to speak, assuming they can be touched in that way?
I'm not sure I'm thinking about the same program.
PROMPT is a way to teach autistic children to speak that uses more like manipulation of the face to try to get them to form the correct position for the mouth and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, even going to the idea of using sign language. Sign language itself is also a motor skill that we often use observational learning. So the sort of standard answer being, I think it would depend. It would depend for that child. Sometimes I think it's important for us to say that if we need to be manipulating the mouth, because we can't really manipulate the tongue, right, in order to produce responses. But there are, throughout all sorts of types of motor instruction, I think there are cues we can give in order to help people get that feeling. Or Janine and I were talking beforehand too about the mirror being something that's difficult in visual information, but perhaps using that visual information to get the feel. And so I think the ways in which we learn and the sensory information that we use is going to depend on each individual. But I'm sorry, I don't know that program well enough to comment if there's large trials or anything like that.
There's a lot of focus and support for young children, for toddlers up till they're 21. What is the information out there about older people with autism? Does anybody know what to expect? I'm talking about 40 and 50-year-olds. What's out there in information?
That's a great question. Dr. Montgomery, would that be something you'd like to speak on?
So we've done a little bit of our work with adults over 21. We rarely work with people past about 45, but when we have done our programming for adults, the door is pretty much open. It just depends on the goals being the same. So in terms of local interventions, we run things through Asperger Manitoba. We're not currently running a group, but they run peer support groups, so that's one component that might locally be of interest. In terms of adults across the spectrum, I can speak to this from my clinical experience because I have assessed and diagnosed a number of 50-year-olds plus. What I see in terms of their challenges is that they have had ongoing challenges similar to what other people on the autism spectrum have throughout their life. However, sometimes by the time you get to age 40 and 50, it starts to look more like really odd personality traits, and people will say they're uncooperative, they're paranoid, they're all of these different things. And my question is always, if you've had a life where people have treated you differently, how would you develop differently? And so that's one of the concerns out there. In terms of literature in the older individuals, there was a UK study out a few years ago that actually looked at prevalence rates, potential prevalence rates in the adult population. And what they found is they're the same as in the child population. There are a large number of undiagnosed adults here and around the world. The UK study that looked at prevalence, where they found about 1 in 100, so that's a very conservative prevalence estimate. They also examined how long it took for an adult with autism seeking some help and support around a diagnosis to get from talking to the first person they speak to, whether that be a therapist, a counselor, or a medical practitioner, all the way to actually having the diagnostic procedures completed. And what they found is, on average, it takes about 9 years for an adult to receive that information. In my clinical experience here in Winnipeg, although we have many wonderful health providers, there does appear to be a gap in that range, and I've seen similar stories where people have been bouncing from one referral for 2 to 3 years before actually seeing someone who can help them. So unfortunately, because autism didn't pop into the DSM until the mid-80s, mid to late 80s, Toby? The first one? I don't even remember now. 94 was when Asperger's came in. Yeah.
Could have been 84, I'm not sure.
So there's a ton of people who weren't in school at those early ages where you would usually get diagnosed. There's also been some research saying that people were diagnosed with severe language and intellectual disabilities when really autism spectrum may have been a better fit, looking retrospectively at people in care and those sorts of things. So in terms of what we can do for the adult population, really it's the same thing we do for our other young adults and beyond, except understand that later in adulthood is a different kind of life, and that there are different challenges, there are different stressors, there are different responsibilities. But ultimately we need to support and accept them and have more resources in our communities that will help us to understand that people on the autism spectrum are people first. And they have a lot to contribute. Unfortunately, I see a lot of adults who've been marginalized and don't feel that they can. So I think our advocacy agencies, support groups are doing great work there, but there's always room for more volunteers, so join those agencies. Good.
I'll come to you in the back there. I think you were first.
Most of the advocacy agencies and support groups are volunteer-driven in this province, and so yeah, if you have a heart behind that, get involved.
Hi, question for anybody, I guess. In regards to diagnosing smaller children under 5, just wondering what the opinion is on the ADOS test.
Don't ask me, I hate that test. But I hate that test mostly because I work with higher functioning individuals and adults. And the research shows it's actually not very good in those groups, and it's abysmal in women and not so good in girls. That said, in terms of early development, the kids that you catch early have some more obvious features, and the ADOS is an okay tool for that purpose. My hesitation around it is that it takes intense amount of training that costs a lot of money. It takes about 2 hours to do an interview, about an hour and a half to do the ADOS, and then there's a paired interview called the ADIR, the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised. So those two things take me about 4.5 hours. I can do way more than that, including cognitive tests that help me identify processing strengths and weaknesses, tests of neuropsychological functioning, as well as diagnostic tests within about 5 hours that hit more areas. So that's one problem I have. The other problem is, if any of you are fans of test statistics, open that manual someday and see how many participants they had. I think in their adult group for the ADOS, which is where I look, they had about 60 participants. About 30 of those had autism. And their hit rates for accurate diagnosis was not very good in adults. So I'm very concerned about the use for adults. Ultimately, I think psychologists are trained clinicians, and psychologists are trained to do a battery of tests that will give you that information in different ways. And so most psychologists I know kind of lean towards not doing the ADOS or the ADIR, or they do it for a while and find it very time consuming, and that they can get that information through other interviews and other ways of doing things. That said, those manuals, those tests are also designed for other disciplines to use who don't have direct training and supervision in assessment and diagnosis. And for those practitioners who are eligible to diagnose, I think it probably is one of the appropriate tools out there. So personally, no, not a fan. I know a lot of people think you can't diagnose without it, but really, given that the stats are about 75% of our individuals are high functioning now to 25% who are the kind of more classical, lower functioning form of autism, it, to me, is appropriate for a very restricted range of individuals, and also not the individuals I deal with. Hope that helps.
I just want to talk about ADOS. I mean, when you take a 4 or a 5-year-old or a child who is extremely stressed and has social inhibition, and then there is this strange person in the room who's trying to administer a test, is that going to be accurate? The child is going to freeze, and they're not going to perform.
If they're a trained clinician, that won't be an issue. But you're right, if they don't have that training and that supervision in their ability to build rapport.
It's subjective about who administers the test. There are probably other tests where eye movement is tracked and others, which probably may be more accurate.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to some of the other early behavioural measures that they're looking at. So one of them, is the idea of looking at joint attention and that being able to respond to pointing. And it's reasonably good by around 18 months. But again, a lot of these developmental milestones aren't achieved until later in development. And there's so much inherent variability because, as we said, humans are variable. That's one of the things that make us unique and interesting. And so there's no one age where we can say, oh, you can't do that, that means this. There's so many other reasons. But that responding to joint attention or an interest in sharing can be one way. There's some nice Canadian research where they're starting to try to look at eye tracking with infants and their ability to shift their attention, what we call disengage. So the way that the researchers describe it is as sticky attention, so that an infant who is more likely to be diagnosed with autism later on is more likely to stick their attention to a location and have a harder time shifting to something else in their environment. But for the most part, a lot of these tests have been done so far with siblings who have an older sibling who has autism, and that may look different depending on the genetic environment, and we may have multiple subgroups. And so a lot of these early tests are done looking at children who are at higher risk because we're trying to monitor, and so it's giving us one picture, but certainly we are a long way from having your 6-month-old do an eye tracking test at the doctor's and be able to make any decisions. I would say even the 18 to 24 months, those are usually kids that are being monitored more closely because there's a concern for other reasons.
Thank you. There were a couple of questions on this side that the hands went up about the same time as the previous question.
Girls seem to be diagnosed with Asperger's at a later age. Do girls present differently than boys?
Great question.
There's actually a lot of emerging literature in that area. In the last 5 years, there's been a real burst, and yeah, that's what the literature is saying. So one of the aspects is that girls tend to develop language, all girls, quicker than boys, on average, right? So some boys will certainly develop quicker, but on average, most girls develop language quicker. Language is an important social function, right? So what a lot of the literature out there says is that the sophisticated language abilities of girls, particularly with the higher functioning forms of autism like Asperger's, may actually mask their issues. Another piece is that sometimes there's stereotypic interests. So we talked before about repetitive behaviors. We didn't talk about stereotypic interests or repeated obsessive types of interests. And I waffle on calling them obsessive because sometimes they're very functional. So you might have a professor who studies the way that animals are kept to give, you know, a better experience of living for those animals and also pay off in production, right? Mm-hmm. So there is actually a woman with autism who does that and is quite famous for it. So you might have this refined area of interest. I don't like, and for that reason I don't like to call it an obsession. However, when it comes to girls, young girls, there's been some research documenting the types of interests that higher functioning girls with autism spectrum disorders tend to have, and they often are things like Barbies, horses, rainbows, you know, all sorts of things that are considered traditional girly activities, whatever that means. And because they kind of fit within that niche, that may also mask it. That said, the difference between a typical interest and an autistic-like stereotypical interest is the intensity and the level of detail that those individuals tend to have. So if it's about Barbies, they will know what year certain Barbies were made. They will be able to tell you the discrete differences between different Barbies. They may have other kind of categorizations that they have about Barbies, and they will be fonts of knowledge about that topic, whether it be Barbies or something else, to the extent that other kids their age, they're just telling you, I like Western Barbie. It's not the same sophisticated level of development. So yeah, so those sorts of things, those are the two main criteria. They seem to have something masking there, and they also tend to have less challenging behaviors as well. And so we all know kids who get referred to the school psychologists or other psychologists tend to be the ones who are causing difficulties. And so if they're introverted, if they're a little bit more withdrawn and they like their stuff, they're probably not going to flag anyone's attention. So I hope that answers your question. Yes. I agree.
Okay, well, we have time for one more question.
I just want to say I really enjoyed all of your topics, but my question is about the plasticity of the brain and that you addressed, very, very refreshing. When you also spoke about your research, you talked about strengths, building on the strength. All of these kids have strengths and difficulties. You can build on the strength to overcome the difficulties. One of the things I'd like to know is exercise. How does that connect the neurons to help them? Because I think that is one of the things people tend to overlook, and the exercise is quite important in these kids to develop much faster.
Yes.
Would you be able to say something about that?
There's a process in the brain known as neurogenesis, right? And most of the neurogenesis stops around the time of birth, and then you have the extensions of neuronal arbors and then development of synaptic connections. There are certain regions in the brain where neurogenesis continues to occur even in the adulthood. So one of those regions is the dentate gyrus, part of the hippocampus in the parietal lobe. That is required. Dentate gyrus is a region that's critically important for learning and memory. And it has been shown by some of my colleagues in Canada and in the US that exercise enhances neurogenesis and synaptic connectivity. And more recently, newborn, the ability to generate new neurons was found to be in a region known as striatum in the human brain. Now the striatum is very interesting because it really controls a lot of functions, and the corticostriatal connections are involved in stereotypical behaviors as well. So you can imagine that exercise would increase synaptic connections in the striatum as well. And so, of course, there's nothing wrong with doing exercise, but in fact it has a net beneficial effect. So yes, everyone should exercise.
I can say the state of the evidence is still growing in this area, but certainly seeing on a personal note that interval training or giving kids sort of 10 minutes on an exercise bike before they do their activities, it sets up the brain from a neurochemical perspective for learning, and it helps the kids be able to focus and have the attention as well, because they've gotten out some of that extra energy. And so I think this is one of those things that, like the social emotional intelligence, would be good for all kids. The more activity we can give them during the day and really build that as part of the system, but certainly giving those activity breaks and the high intensity for sort of 10 minutes and then work on can help people really focus a lot more.
I think the only thing I'd add there is that exercise also helps with things like anxiety and mood, and so those are other things that might be implicated in people with autism spectrum disorders as well as the general population. So if any of those things are things you cope with, well, we're thinking about it.
This region of the brain that I was talking to you about, the dentate gyrus, is also implicated very strongly in stress and anxiety. So you can see the direct connection. The exercise is extremely beneficial for stress and anxiety.
Well, wonderful. Thanks very much for those responses. And thank you very much for all your contributions to this evening. We'll bring things to a close. Well, please join me in thanking our researchers tonight. And so just a few prompts in closing. First of all, please remember the evaluations that were left for you on your chair for this event. We really appreciate it. Please take a moment to check out the materials that are on the table up at the front, which, by the way, are conveniently located next to the refreshments. Thank you again.